Hi, I'm Ed Sceery. The video you're about to watch was made many years ago on my original elk research and studies of the elk language and how elk communicate. Every elk hunter should see and hear this classic wildlife video.
Welcome to Ed Sceery's High Country Outdoor Classroom. Sit back and get comfortable as Ed, one of America's well-known authorities on elk and elk hunting, reviews state-of-the-art information he has discovered about how elk communicate. The fieldwork and research information presented in this video will prove extremely valuable to all elk hunters and is sure to increase your chances for success on your next elk hunt. Ed's extensive research on the language of Rocky Mountain elk has substantially increased our knowledge of elk communication and has resulted in major changes in traditional elk calling and hunting methods. Now, let's join Ed in the high country of the Rocky Mountains.
Hi, I'm Ed Sceery. I guess you can tell we're here in the Rocky Mountains this morning, and I'm going to talk to you a little about the research that I've done with elk and the elk language for the past 8 years. I think you're going to find I've uncovered some very interesting information that is sure to help you with your hunting activities. The information presented to you on this tape is all firsthand from my original research work, which I previously presented on an audio cassette tape. Some of the information I presented may even differ with previous information I've talked about. This will likely continue as we learn more about the animals we hunt. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to review information I've learned about the various sounds that elk make and how they use these sounds to relay information to one another. This is what I call the elk language. I'm going to let you listen to some elk sounds that I've recorded, and probably most important, I'm going to give you some guidelines on how to use this information to increase your luck hunting elk and how to use your elk calls more effectively. In studying the language of wild animals, we have to use caution when trying to compare it to humans and how humans communicate. This is the most common problem I face when studying animal communication. The general assumption of many people is that animals must be able to communicate in a manner similar to humans. Unfortunately for us, this is not necessarily true. Humans have a very extensive vocabulary, and we generally relay very detailed information when we communicate with each other. While studies have shown that some mammals have rather extensive complex vocabularies, wild animals have very limited vocabularies when compared to humans. Rather than relaying specific detailed information, wild animals usually communicate in general moods or general messages or the feeling that they may be in at the time. The split-hooved ruminant animals of North America fall into the category of those animals having a very limited vocabulary. We're all familiar with this group of animals because it includes both domestic cattle and sheep, domestic goats, and the wild elk and deer. I want you to understand that I don't believe these animals have a lot to say to each other. In other words, they don't communicate much information. However, the sounds and messages that they do communicate can be very important to the hunter, especially the hunter that goes afield with an elk bugle or a cow talk type of elk call. While I'm going to restrict this discussion to the subject of elk, keep in mind that many of the language characteristics of domestic cattle, domestic sheep, and elk are rather similar. Those of you that have access to a herd of domestic cattle or sheep should spend some time out observing and watching them communicate and watching their behavior in relation to the sounds that they make. If you have access to a herd of elk, better yet, watch and listen to the elk. One of the problems in figuring out how elk communicate is to isolate the different sounds they make and associate these sounds with specific behavior. What we generally hear when we're near a herd of elk is a lot of vocalizations made by many different animals in a short period of time. This tends to make it very difficult to isolate and study specific sounds or vocalizations. Now watch and listen to these elk. When a large number of elk are communicating at the same time, it's very difficult to isolate specific sounds that they're making. This was one of the biggest problems I had when I started my research on elk communication and language. When I began my work, about all that was known about the elk language was that elk bugled, they made the cow-talking sounds, and of course we also knew that they barked. From listening to these various sounds, it's reasonable to assume, and we all probably agree, that the elk are communicating with each other and relaying some sort of information with these various sounds. The big question is what information are they relaying and how are they doing it? I'll get to that in a few minutes. Now let's talk about the elk hunter. Most elk hunters go afield with a bugle call or a cow talk type of call. Hunters have traditionally blown on these calls in efforts to mimic the sounds that elk make. Because of the potential to sell elk calls, I see a lot of magazine advertisements that claim to have great secret new discoveries about elk calling. They also claim to have great new elk calls that are the best on the market. Well, from what I've seen in the last few years is the majority of these are from companies back east that have produced cheap copies of patented Western elk calls. I hope you're not fooled by these guys. When you go out to purchase elk hunting equipment, I'd encourage you to stick to buying equipment made by several good reputable game call manufacturers in the western states. I don't think you're going to find any great new discoveries about elk. What you need to learn are the basic facts about the animals and use this information to become better hunters. Be wary of great new discoveries about elk hunting and elk calls, especially if these discoveries come from companies back east where there aren't any elk. What most experienced elk hunters have come to learn is that the traditional bugling for elk does just not work very well. Most often, traditional bugling for elk doesn't work. Now, you can take my word for that, or you can go out and spend several years in the field hunting yourself and learn the hard way. But there are times when bugling does work, so don't go out and throw your bugles away just yet. While they certainly tend to be more effective than bugles, they aren't foolproof either. And without any question, cow calls can also present problems to the elk hunter. Just like bugling, it's really important that you know how to use a cow call and what sounds to make with them. The poor luck of hunters using elk bugles and cow calls doesn't surprise me. And it shouldn't surprise you either. You see, what hunters have been doing for many years is blowing on elk calls without any specific information or knowledge about the types of elk sounds that they were trying to mimic. Hunters are making various sounds of the elk language without any specific knowledge of how the elk will respond or react to those sounds. To date, elk hunters have been working on general opinions about how elk respond to different vocalizations. When you blow on an elk call, You know you're making some elk sounds or elk vocalizations, but you don't have a good idea of what information you're communicating to the elk, and I think that's real important. A lot of elk hunters have the false impression that the bigger and more aggressive sounding a bull bugle is, the more effective it will be for calling elk. Well, that's not true. Big, loud, aggressive bugle calls sound really neat, and they win a lot of elk calling contests. But I don't think these loud, aggressive sounds work very well for calling elk. Let me give you a quick review of the history of what was known about the elk language prior to my research. Basically, we knew that elk bugled around the time of the rut and at other times of the year. We also knew that the bugles were most likely threats from one bull to another, or advertisements to nearby cows. While elk make many different types of bugling sounds, no efforts had been made to characterize or identify the different bugling sounds made by elk. Now, this is particularly important to hunters using bugle calls. Most hunters use bugle calls, but nobody was familiar enough with the elk language to understand what kind of message they were communicating to elk when they made the bugling sounds. In recent years, many hunters have discovered that elk talk to each other in high-pitched whines. I remember the first time I heard this cow-talking sound. It was in the summer of 1967 while I was working for the U.S. Forest Service in the wilderness of northern New Mexico. I remember being surprised that such a big animal would produce such high-pitched whistling sounds. It's generally been believed that these cow-talking or elk-talking sounds were used by elk to call one another. Well, that's generally true because some of the cow-talking sounds, in fact, are used for that purpose, but others aren't. But similar to the many different types of bugling sounds, elk make many different types of cow-talking sounds. Some of these sounds are cohesive vocalizations. And what I mean by cohesive, I mean sounds made by one elk that are intended to attract another elk. It's a sound that brings animals together. Other elk talking sounds are used as alert or warning sounds. Prior to my research work, little or no efforts had been made to characterize these elk talking sounds. Again, this is particularly important in regards to a hunter using an elk talk type of call, because not all talking sounds serve a cohesive function. Some of the elk talking sounds will alert or frighten nearby elk. You need to be aware that if you blow on your cow call incorrectly, you can easily frighten and chase elk away. That's why it's extremely important for hunters to have a basic understanding of elk language. And this is true no matter what type of elk call you use. Historically, when hunters have gone into the field to call and hunt elk, they haven't known what messages they were really sending to nearby elk. They were just making various random elk sounds with their calls. Of course, this presented problems because we didn't know why animals would or would not respond to those calls. All we knew is that we were making some specific elk sounds that we'd heard in the past or that someone had taught us on an instructional cassette tape. Well, we possibly knew a little more. We did know that sometimes elk would react to the vocalizations and approach us. But what the majority of elk hunters have discovered is that most often the elk would retreat and leave the area when presented with big aggressive bugling sounds. Some interesting research conducted by Colorado State University supports this. They found that on public land hunts where elk are disturbed by hunters, the probability is no better than 1 in 10 that a bull will respond to traditional bugling methods. I've been telling hunters the same thing for years. Almost every time you blow aggressively on a bugle call, you'll chase nearby bulls away. At least 9 out of 10 times if you're hunting and calling on anything but virgin territory. Because of the number of elk hunters these days, it's nearly impossible to find an area that doesn't get some hunting pressure. Now let's get a little bit more into the meat of the subject here, how elk actually do communicate. First of all, let's forget about the human language, because elk don't speak that way. Elk speak or communicate in what is referred to as graded vocalizations. Graded vocalizations are sounds that are made in a scale of intensity. Rather than having many different words in their vocabulary, they are limited to only a few different types of sounds. Of course, we're familiar with many of the sounds that elk make: the bugles, the grunts, the cow-talking sounds, and the barks. Let's first discuss the commonly heard cow-talking sounds. These are the high-pitched bird-like sounds that not only cows make, but all elk make. Due to the fact that all elk make these sounds, I like to refer to these vocalizations as elk talk rather than just cow talk. This elk talk, or the high-pitched squeals or whines, is one class of vocalizations that elk make. They make a number of different variations of these talking vocalizations, and each variation relays different information. One thing that I've found particularly important to hunters is that slight differences in the elk talking or the cow talking sounds can make big differences in how the animals react. One of the most important things I'll say on this subject is that small differences in the sound of your cow call can yield big differences in the vocalizations you're trying to mimic, and they will yield big differences in the response of elk to your calling efforts. Now let me give you a quick example with my Ace 1 cow call. Now this sound will attract elk. It goes from high to low. And this sound will chase them away or alert elk. Can you hear the difference? It's pretty slight. Let me try it again. This one will attract them. And this will chase them away. These differences are so slight that they're very easy to get confused. I'm sure many hunters are inadvertently spooking elk with their cow calls. They didn't know what vocalizations they were making, or in other words, they didn't know what they were saying to the elk. How can you figure out the productive sounds versus the non-productive sounds? Well, it's not too difficult. Let's review what we've learned about cow or elk talking sounds. First, elk talk or communicate in what is referred to as graded vocalizations. In other words, their language is on a scale from low to high intensity. And the low intensity sounds are the cohesive sounds that tend to draw other animals to them. Now the main characteristic of a cohesive sound is in the pitch of the sound, and it goes from high to low pitch at a steady rate. Now let me graph this out for you and show you on a graph how this looks. If we look at the intensity of the sound over a period of time, and that's just a few seconds, it goes from high to low like this. Ew, ew. Now that's a cohesive sound that will attract animals to one another. Now listen to an elk making the same sound. These are the cohesive sounds that are the ones that you should make with your elk talk calls. These are the relaxed sounds that elk make to communicate with each other. These sounds tend to keep the animals relaxed and together. Now, as we proceed up the scale and intensity of these graded vocalizations of cow talking sounds, we get sounds that start to relay different information. They relay messages to alert other elk, and the pattern changes. And while we have a downward trend in the intensity of cohesive sounds, the alert or warning sounds take a different pattern. The pattern of alert and warning sounds starts to go up a little bit in the middle before it goes down. And when the cow talking sounds get that pattern, it starts to alert other animals in the area. This is a higher intensity vocalization, and it serves to draw attention of other nearby animals and serves to spread the message that all is not well. It's an alert type of vocalization. Can you hear how the sound goes from low to high and then dropping off to the lower sound at the end? It has a peak in the middle. Now let's listen to an actual recording of elk making this type of vocalization. Now further up on this graded scale of cow talking vocalization, the pattern is even more peaked in the middle, like this. And further up, it's a straight peak. So this is the graded scale of cow talking vocalizations. Now let me demonstrate each one of these to you with a cow call. All right, first let's try the cohesive sound going from high to low. And that sounds like this. It goes from high to low. It's a cohesive sound, draws animals toward you. If we put a little peak in the middle of the sound, that's an alert warning sound that will not help you hunting. If we go a little bit higher, the animals become more nervous. They do this. And up to the point where they'll bark. And I can do that a little bit with a cow call. And that's the most intense sound in a graded vocalization of elk talking sounds. So from low to high, you stick to the low intensity, very calm, relaxed, cohesive sounds when you're trying to call an elk with a cow type call like this. The more quiet and relaxed you can make it, the more effective it will be for calling elk. What I want you to understand is that the cow uses a greater intensity in her vocalizations to relay a more important message to other elk. One thing that I want to repeat is that these talking sounds are not restricted to cows, but they're made by all elk. The cows spend a lot of time talking to their calves, and the calves to their mothers. The most obvious difference between the two is that the calves have a higher pitched voice than the older, more mature cows in the herd. The specific vocalizations and the way they are produced are quite similar, though. Now let me demonstrate to you the cohesive sound of a cow and the cohesive sounds of a calf. Cow sounds are lower than a calf. This will be a cow. And a calf. So you can make the different cow sounds and calf sounds with this call. From my experience, the bulls do not make the talking sounds as frequently as the cows. However, I've heard bulls make the high-intensity warning barks at least as often as the cows do. You can apply this information directly to your hunting situations if you listen to the elk that you're stalking. Elk that are producing low-intensity, cohesive talking sounds, you can assume they're calm and they're not aware that you're stalking them. The more intense the talking sounds you hear, the more excited the elk are becoming, and you may have to back off on your stalking a little bit. Quiet, low-intensity cow calls made by you will very often serve a cohesive function of bringing the animals to you and to calm down a group of elk that have shown some indication that they've become nervous. It's surprising how quickly the low-intensity cohesive sounds will relax nearby elk. Now I want to show you some footage that demonstrates this. Now bear in mind that the elk that I'm going to show you has just been shot at and missed by a rifle. Cow calls can be extremely effective. You should use cow calls to attract elk to your position, to coax them in for a good clean standing shot, and to call back elk that you've missed. Now watch this elk that's just been stopped for a good clean broadside shot. And this bull, it was coaxed to within easy bow range. Now this next sequence was taken late in the evening, and you can see how irresistible these cow-talking sounds can be. Notice how this bull seems to be attracted to this sound like a magnet. That broken tined bull was one of several that I called in that evening within a half an hour. If you remember the various cow-talking sounds and hear them while you're hunting, they'll give you an idea as to what behavior to expect from an individual elk or a herd of elk. Let me quickly review what I've said about the cow talk or elk talking sounds. First, they're graded vocalizations, from low-intensity cohesive sounds to moderately intense alert sounds, and then to high-intensity warning barking sounds. The low-intensity cohesive vocalizations that go from high to low pitch are the ones that you need to stick to if your intent is to call an elk to your position. This brings us to another subject. How often do elk make or repeat these sounds? They often repeat their vocalizations many times. Well, what's the significance of the number of times that elk make the same vocalization? Well, I think we've got more to learn on this subject. However, at this point, I'm willing to speculate that the more times an elk repeats an individual vocalization or message indicates another form of intensity of the vocalization. Let me give you an example of a cow repeating a high to low cohesive vocalization over and over many times. Now this particular cow was adjacent to a breeding herd of elk, and she made these sounds over a period of about 15 minutes and called the herd bull up the hill to her. I watched the action, and her calling efforts were answered by the herd bull, who left his harem and went to meet her. She makes the same vocalization over and over again to reinforce her message. Remember, if you repeat the same message over and over, you are just reinforcing the same message. With a repetitive high to low cohesive sound, you are providing a lot of encouragement for nearby animals to approach you. But I'd warn you to be cautious about calling too much. Bull elk use the same method of repeating a single bugling sequence many times to reinforce the message that they're trying to convey. From a practical hunting standpoint, I think you should intentionally limit the number of times that you make elk vocalizations with your calls. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the animals can easily hear you make one or two calls at quite a distance, so you don't have to worry about being heard. Secondly, the more you blow on an elk call, the greater the possibility that the animal you're trying to attract will figure out that you really aren't an elk. My theory is you give them some information, but don't give them too much. There's some exceptions with bugling or cow calling a very aggressive, receptive bull during the peak of the rut. At the peak of the rut, aggressive bugling and cow calling can be very effective. With a cow type or elk talk type of call, such as my Ace 1, I personally limit the use of it to blowing 2 to 4 series per hour of hunting time. Now each series may be 1 or 2 high-pitched chirps with the call. The Ace 2 Seducer Bull Coaxer is for use only a few times to get a nearby bull within range of your weapon and stop for a good shot. Now the Ace 3 Hyper Cow and Heat call can easily reproduce the repetitive, cohesive calls of a cow in heat during the rut. One thing you want to keep in mind is not to spend all morning long blowing on elk calls while you're actively hunting. This is not a productive way to hunt, and it upsets other hunters in the area. Be a good sportsman. Game calls won't make you a better hunter. They're tools that will make good hunters more successful. I'm often asked by hunters, how far away can elk hear these high-pitched cow-talking sounds? Well, elk have real good hearing, and I have frequently seen elk respond to these sounds from over 500 yards away. Now, elk will become educated to both bugling and cow-talking sounds. Educated elk are much more difficult to call than elk that have not been previously fooled by a game call. Be particularly careful about bugling and cow calling in your camp or in the hunting area prior to hunting season. This can only hurt your hunting efforts. Now let's talk about the elk bugling sounds. Now, elk bugling sounds are made primarily by bulls, and they're made in a graded scale of vocalizations very similar to the cow-talking sounds. But there's a major difference in the vocalizations of bulls. Bulls, being the aggressive breeding animals, make threatening, aggressive bugling sounds. We can easily speculate that bugling serves several functions. Bulls bugle to notify cows of their location. They serve to make contact with and notify other bulls of their presence. They serve to indicate dominance within a herd. They may serve to indicate a bull's territory, and of course bulls threaten and challenge other bulls during the breeding season with these sounds. Now let me review and graph out the graded scale of bull bugling vocalizations, and you'll see how it somewhat corresponds to the pattern of the cow-talking sounds. Again, the bull bugling vocalizations are in a pattern of intensity over time. The least intense on the scale we call a cohesive or a contact bugle goes from high to low. Like this. As the bull becomes more excited or makes a more intense sound, the pattern changes to this. As he becomes more excited, more aggressive, the sound is like this. With some grunts following the bugle. And that's what we call a traditional bugling sound. And on a scale of aggression with bull bugles, the more intense sound over a traditional bugling sound, we get a scream, which I graph out like this, and a roar, which is the highest intense sound that the bulls make. So bulls make sounds from cohesive contact bugles to bugling sounds with a higher pitch in the middle, to the traditional bugling sounds followed by the grunts, to screams, and then the roars. Now the roars are the most intense, most aggressive, intimidating sounds that bulls make. And these are the sounds that are typically made by the herd bulls. Now let me try to demonstrate some of these different bugling vocalizations with a diaphragm and a grunt tube. The first one I'll make is the cohesive or the contact bugle that goes from high to low. Okay, next, a bull that is a little bit more aggressive puts a peak in the middle of it. It peaks in the middle. Now let's make a traditional bugle that we've all heard and it has been taught to us over many years. That's this pattern here. That's more aggressive on the scale of intensity. When we get higher intensity sounds, we get screams. Sounds something like this. Higher yet, we get the roars, which typically the herd bulls will make. And that's basically the scale of bull vocalizations. Now I want you to remember that this is basically a solid scale, and they will make sounds between each one of these that I've graphed out. So it's a continuous scale of intensity from low intensity to high intensity. And I've demonstrated for you some of the real common specific ones that we hear when we're out in the field. Now when I'm trying to call bulls, attract them to my position, I frequently stick to the lower intensity sounds. You get to the more high intense sounds, the more aggressive, dominant bull sounding bugles, you tend to chase the bulls away from you. Now, when you're listening to bulls bugle, you'll hear them make these different sounds. Frequently, if we're around a breeding herd, we will hear the traditional bugles being made and the screams being made by satellite bulls trying to get in on the herd. We'll hear the roars, which are the most dominant, aggressive sounds, being made by the dominant aggressive bull that's in control of the harem. Dominant satellite bulls or younger bulls may not be capable of making these roaring sounds. In addition, these roaring sounds may be related to the degree of physical maturity of an individual animal. They may also be an indication of the level of dominant male characteristics. This is related to the level of male hormones within individual bulls. The size of a bull or the number of points on a rack does not always correspond to the level of vocal aggression displayed by a bull. In other words, the dominant roaring herd bull does not always have the largest rack, nor is he always the largest bull. If you were to spend a lot of time in the field with a herd of elk during the breeding season, what you would find is the bulls in the herd threaten each other with aggressive bugling sounds. They do this rather than making actual physical contact and fighting. Most of the interaction between bulls in a herd is done vocally with aggressive sounding bugles. The bull that's able to make the most threatening sounds is often the herd bull. His primary efforts are to intimidate other nearby bulls into retreating. He apparently does this by making the highly aggressive, dominant roaring sounds. This most often works to chase off satellite bulls. If the bull doesn't succeed in his verbal attempt to chase off an intruder, he may have to prove his dominance by physical contact and by a clashing of antlers. Bulls don't spend much time actually fighting, and when they do resort to fighting, it generally is only for a very short time. I need to add one comment here. Now, there's a considerable amount of difference between the bugling in one area versus another area. If you go to one hunting area, you may not hear much bugling, and a few miles away, go to an area the same time of the year, and there'll be a lot of bugling going on. Now, what I think's happening here is in an area where there's a lot of bulls, there's a lot of competition for the cows, and there's a lot of aggressive bugling and competition between the bulls, so you hear a lot of bugling going on. In areas where there are not many bulls, there's not that much competition for the cows, you won't hear much bugling going on. If a bull does not have a lot of challengers to his control of his harem, he has little reason to bugle a lot. Bulls may also suppress their natural desire to bugle in heavily hunted areas. In using bugling sounds to attract other bulls, one important consideration is whether the bull you're trying to call is a dominant herd bull that's gathered a harem of cows, or the bull is a lone satellite bull without a harem. Bulls that are in control of a harem of cows have little reason to respond to your bugles by changing their location and approaching you. They will, however, answer your bugles. So what this does is it gives you an idea of their location. So use bugle calls to locate bulls, not necessarily to try to call them to you. Should you approach a herd bull and his harem of cows and make high-intensity, dominant bugling sounds, the most expected and common response to get is have the herd bull gather his cows and leave the area. That's the expected response of loud, dominant, aggressive bugling sounds. Now, this doesn't always happen, but most of the time it does. So leave the big, aggressive bugling for the bugling contests back in town. If you spot and intend to stalk a bull with a harem of cows, avoid using aggressive bugling sounds. Cow talking and non-aggressive contact or cohesive bugling are much more effective. Bugling is more effective with bachelor or satellite bulls that have not gathered a harem of cows. However, don't get carried away by trying to make the most aggressive bugling possible. For more consistent success, make your attempts at calling the bulls with low to moderate intensity bugles and low intensity cow talking sounds. Don't cow talk or bugle too much. Moderation is the key, and it's much more effective. The only exceptions to this is the super aggressive bull during the rut that's intent on challenging you for a fight. You may find with these bulls, the aggressive vocalizations often encourage his approach. However, I believe that holding your bugling to one step or more below the intensity of the sounds of your challenger will be more effective. Cow calling with a repetition of cow and heat sounds can also be very effective during the rut. Bugle calls should be used primarily as locator calls. Use bugle calls to get distant bulls to answer you and give away their location to you. Then approach the bulls silently, making occasional cow calling sounds. If you have the strong urge to bugle, try to stick to the low intensity, cohesive bugling sounds. Well, I hope some of the information that I provided you will be a help on your next elk hunt. Before I go, I want to remind you to follow your local game laws, be a good sportsman, and above all, be careful with your firearms and other weapons. Adios, y que te vaya bien en la casada.
For a free color catalog of the Sceery line of professional game calls, other audio and videotapes, or for information on hunting seminars, phone or write the E.J. Sceery Company in Santa Fe, New Mexico. E.J. Sceery Company, P.O. Box 6520, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 87502-6520. Or phone toll free, 1-800-327-4322.